Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I'll research a case and Brad here and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So, before we get into today's case, there is something we do have to discuss. Like a small little thing happened over the last week from last episode to this episode. A video we took a few weeks back at a local nerdlesque drag show. Some of you may or may not have seen it. It currently, I think, has
Almost 30 million views.
on Instagram, like 3 million on TikTok, like 1 million currently on Facebook, and it is just growing and growing, and it's the biggest thing we've ever posted to date. And, it was one of those things where it's just, made up with friends, some friends we haven't seen in a while, so we went to a local support some queer artists at a local burlesque drag show at a brewing company.
Where you gotta be 21 or up to come in.
So, and that was the thing is like the videos started getting bigger and bigger. And of course, when you have that kind of exposure, you do start to draw the attention of less than savory people and a lot of people who may not share the same viewpoint as you.
Meaning there's a lot of hate on it. There's a lot of support, but there's also a lot of hate. And it is literally a drag queen coming up to one of our friends. She gives her money. She falls back into my arms, and then another friend is like got a surprised look on her face. Kind of cute. I put it on my handlebar ASMR on Instagram, and it went crazy. And I have to say, the algorithm has worked for me because for years now, I've not really seen much hate on my feed. I guess it shows it to like-minded people and everything like that. So I'm really shocked to see just the amount of hate that it is getting. I mean, it's got thousands and thousands and thousands upon thousands of views and comments now. And it's kind of like goes back and forth with people arguing back and forth, but I'm just not used to that kind of hate. It kind of surprised me, kind of burst that little bubble that I had that maybe things are getting better.
Yeah, and that's, kind of honestly the first negative feedback on anything we posted that we've ever gotten. And what's funny the last week is like the open-minded people versus the bigots, and all our friends got involved, even friends that are live in different states, they're jumping on there, getting involved, and it's literally like kind of like Endgame where there's two different sides going at it constantly. And of course, that just drives the algorithm up more because, the algorithm loves negative comments more than positive comments, and there are over almost 10,000 negative comments. Well, either negative comments or people fighting those, leaving negative comments. So it's just going and going. But also that has led to an uptick in followers for the podcast. So if you're here from that post, welcome aboard. So there's good and bad things for all of it. But it has been a doozy of a week because I have jumped in and also fought a little bit. Not on the official podcast page. We try to remain neutral with that just because this is about true crime, queer history, victims, and honestly don't have the energy to waste my breath fighting these horrible, awful people when we could be focusing on the real victims and why we're here.
Yeah,
I save that for my personal time. So when I log off the podcast page, I log into my alternate account and then just have fun.
it's basically a 30 million person tavern brawl at this point. Like I said, it's just there's some positives and there's a lot of negatives. It just kind of has me worried at the state of things, because I would think that it would be a lot of older people having the negative comments and everything, but it's not. There's comments from all ages, all genders. It's pretty crazy.
But yeah, and it's not all bad. Some good things have come of it. The drag queen that was featured in that video has blew up. I'm so glad to see her get her what do they say? Get her flowers. That's what I was looking for. She was amazing. And it was so funny, actually. I got to talk about this. We'll get into the case soon, I promise. But this kind of ties into with like queer rebellion, because as you can tell from the title of this episode, it is a queer history episode. But like, it was so funny because the way people perceived the video. So a lot of the comments were, "Oh, this is a drag queen. What about the kids? Men are sick who dress up as women." And it's so funny because we go, okay, one, that is a AFAB drag queen, assigned female at birth. She identifies as a female. So wrong. Two, it's at a brewery, which is 21 and up. There are no children here. So it is a little bit more risque. And it wasn't even sexual.
She was dressed as She-Go from Kim Possible.
And it's even more funny because one of the biggest ones on there is like, that girl and that man, Brad, are a couple, and he is a cuckold to her.
And she's a whore for giving money to another lady in front of me, because I should stand up for myself and tell her she can't do that.
But it's so funny because it actually gave me a really good perspective. Like we all see viral videos and videos on the internet, and everyone, it's so interesting to be on the other side of that and to see all these strangers form opinions and to see how way off base they are. And it really just put in perspective to me. Like when I see videos online, I'm like, well, what is the actual story behind this? Because you can read the comments and they can say whatever the hell they want in the comments. And so it's so fascinating just knowing the truth and then seeing what people, the truth, quote unquote, that people invent in their own head. If you haven't seen the video, I highly recommend you go check it out because it is fascinating. And yeah, it is just fighting the good fight on there. But that is just a little bit of what we've been up to this week. Hopefully your guys' week has been interesting, chill.
And we're sorry that we're a day late, but both of us, I believe, got food poisoned this weekend and was sick as dogs. Multiple throw ups, a lot of spending time on the couch and recuperating. So we're just getting back to a little bit of normalcy. So sorry for the delay.
Yeah, so it was a rough weekend and we're still feeling the effects of it. But at the same time, we want to get this episode out there to you guys as soon as possible. And so, yeah, I guess without further ado, let's get into it. But that was our little adventure so far. So following up Brad's episode last week covering the 2009 police raid on the Atlanta Eagle, which if you haven't listened to yet, highly recommend you do, I also have a similar story for you guys of queer rebellion in the face of oppression from law enforcement. Now I figured you guys would need a little break after our Randy Kraft two-parter, which got really heavy and really rough. And it was one of those stories, it's one of those stories where it's like it needs to be told, but at the same time, it's a rough story to tell. So this week's case is also one that has been requested by several of you. So I'm happy to finally be able to do it and to bring attention to one of the most important events in queer history. This will also kind of be the first part in a little series I want to do every now and again moving forward. Not like consecutively, but every now and then, where we discuss incidents of queer rebellion and uprisings prior to Stonewall. Now, Stonewall is by far the most infamous and well-known event in our very colorful history. But while it remains the most important and well-known uprising, it was far from the first. So today, for Volume 1 of Queer Uprisings Before Stonewall, we're going to be talking about the 1966 Compton's Cafeteria Riot, an event that would mark the beginning of the trans liberation movement across San Francisco, something that even Stonewall wouldn't be able to do for quite some time in other areas of the world. Now, this is the story of a group of trans individuals and drag queens who just wanted to be left alone to live their lives as true and authentic as possible, but when faced with oppression from the local PD, were forced to rise up and shout, "Enough is enough." So let's jump right into it. Have you heard of this before, Brad?
I have not.
Well, This is one I've heard like for a while. I've had on the back burner, and like I said, after the Randy Kraft episode, I was like, all right, I want to find a good queer history episode to give to the masses to kind of be as a palate cleanser. And this one was definitely at the top of the list because it is very fascinating and surprisingly not that well known. So by now, we've all heard of Stonewall. If you didn't know before, you most certainly have heard about it now because we mention it in just about every episode of the podcast, and that's not an exaggeration. Its impact was so great and widespread that it did influence the entire world, and 90% of the cases and people we cover were affected by it in some way. Now, what happened on the night of June 28th, 1969, and in the ensuing days will forever live on in infamy as the day the queer community was finally heard across the world, and the spark caused that night would light a fire that spread around the globe as it officially kicked off the gay liberation movement. Thousands flocked to the streets all over America, but especially in New York, as gay men, lesbians, trans people, and drag queens demanded equal rights. This movement would cause widespread political change that is still felt to this very day. But while Stonewall is undoubtedly the most important and central queer uprising that led to reform, if you're not big into queer history, a lot of people do just assume that the fight for queer rights started in 1969. But that's actually not the case. Rebellions for queer rights date back decades, and just 3 years before Stonewall, another important uprising would occur on the opposite side of the country in America's other central queer hub, San Francisco. Now, although it didn't make as quite a big splash as Stonewall and was almost forgotten about until Stonewall gave it a bit of boost years later, the riots that occurred at Gene Compton's cafeteria on a hot night in August of 1966 would lead to a small but very vocal movement in San Francisco that was almost forgotten about. But thanks to efforts of several historians, we are now able to look back and remember one of the most pivotal moments in queer history and honor those who fought for not just themselves, but generations to come. So I'm not going to spend too much time going in over the history of San Francisco's very long and complex history with the queer community. We have talked about that till we were blue in the face multiple times. It is very deep, very rich, very fascinating. And specifically, if you are really interested in the full in-depth history of San Francisco, I highly recommend you check out episodes 83 and 84, where we cover the case of the Doodler, or episode 103, where we talk about the history of Halloween in the Castro.
Which is a really good episode.
It is. And those episodes, we really get into like the full history of how exactly did San Francisco become such a big queer central hub. It is really fascinating. And like I said, if you want to full in-depth, listen to those episodes. But to briefly summarize in this episode, so in San Francisco, there were 3 distinct districts side by side that were the central hub of queer activity. South of the Market, most famously the Castro, and most infamously the Tenderloin district. These areas were mostly impoverished, filled with condemned buildings and apartments, had high crime rates, and were all around seen as an eyesore on the city. Due to this reputation and the cheap rent that came with it, thousands of marginalized people, mainly queer people of color, flocked to the area and began to turn it into a safe haven for queer people everywhere, with hundreds of gay bars, shops, and theaters popping up over the years. Now, by the late 50s and into the 1960s, a large but secretive society of queer people operated in the area, mainly moving around at night in the various semi-secret gay bars over the city. But of course, this didn't stop the harassment from local PD. Queer people at the time were under constant threat of being arrested, beaten, or outed by cops, both in uniform and undercover, all of who prowled the streets at night throughout the gay districts, just looking for a reason to stop somebody or perform a, quote, surprise raid on one of the bars. And the only way to stop this, of course, was by paying them a hefty fee to turn a blind eye. So it was very shady, very corrupt, and they kind of could just be corrupt because what are you going to do? Being gay was very illegal back then. So they're like, the laws you're breaking are much more severe than the laws we're breaking. So, and that's what made this harassment more terrifying, was that they were well within their rights, according to the law at the time, to harass queer people and especially anyone they thought could be a, quote, cross-dresser. There were extensive laws on the books in regards to trans people, including clothing laws, which stated that everyone must be wearing 3 articles of clothing at all times that matched their assigned gender at birth. If not, they would be arrested for cross-dressing. And like we talked about in episode 103, the only time this rule really didn't apply was during Halloween, which is one of the reasons it's considered gay Christmas. Fun little fact, you want to hear the full story about that? Check out that episode. Now, this harassment was so bad that the dictionary actually lists one of the definitions of Tenderloin as being, quote, a crime-ridden part of the city ruled by corrupt vice. Eventually, a sort of symbiotic bond formed between the queer community of San Francisco and the local PD. Although the PD continuously harassed and arrested people on a nightly basis, there was a bit of illegal activity that they were openly allowing to happen. So it's kind of like, yes, people are still getting arrested, but at the same time, they're still allowing a good portion of, again, what was considered illegal at the time to happen and kind of just went unnoticed.
Just being gay, right?
One was just being gay.
Just being gay and being at bars and congregating as a gay people. That was what was illegal.
That was what was illegal. And like I said, they arrested people on a nightly basis, but there were a lot of gay bars and gay people they just let be a lot of the times because the gay bars paid them off. And on top of that, one of the other big crimes they let happen a lot was public sex work and prostitution, which pretty soon caused the Tenderloin to boom with sex workers and people coming there for sex, as the area quickly gained notoriety as the place to go for sex without the fear of being arrested. So, of course, the Tenderloin is the place to go if you want to pick up a sex worker because the cops know about it and they're not going to do anything. Of course, actually the vast majority of sex workers in the Tenderloin were in fact trans women, mainly trans women of color. This is the 1960s after all, and anyone who was deemed, quote, too gay acting or too queer was refused work at pretty much every single business in the city. They would not hire you if you were gay, and that meant the only way you could support yourself and to make sure you ate every day was to turn to sex work, which so many had to do. This, of course, proved to be extremely dangerous, as they were on the streets every night, going home with strange men, being harassed by police, and even members of their own community. Now, this may or may not come as a surprise to some of you, but even back then, trans people were looked down upon by gay and lesbian people. Of course, not all, but a lot. They were seen as being mentally ill and, quote, gave the gay liberation movement a bad name. And that's what I said something Stonewall even really didn't do. It kind of kicked it off. But if you listen to our episode covering Stonewall, it's like episode 27, you'll know like they did actually kind of exclude the trans people from the initial movement because they were like, we want to get gay rights first, and we think if trans people are involved, the city won't take us seriously. So they just kind of pushed them into the closet. And so it has been a very big struggle for trans people to break out of that closet and finally be heard. Now, this caused many to be discriminated against, even by members of their own community, as many were not even allowed in certain bars or areas of the city. So, of course, you can see how trans people during this time really were fighting battles on every single front. They fought police from being harassed, they fought clients and bigots looking to hurt them or even worse, and they fought fellow queer people to be treated as equals. And of course, after a while, you can only be pushed so far before you finally get tired of it. Now, the concept of trans people and transgenderism first caught the public's eye in the early 1950s when a woman named Christine Jorgensen made headlines for being the first person to successfully undergo gender reassignment surgery in Denmark in 1952. Also, for anyone saying like, oh, trans is a new thing, no. There are cases predating this, but this was the first successful one in 1952. Following this, and as the 60s began, a cultural shift began to grow amongst the youth of America as traditional gender norms started to go out the window. Women grew out their body hair and stopped wearing bras. Men grew their hair out long and started wearing more bright and colorful clothing, as we saw the beginning of the civil rights movement and the opposition to Vietnam. Christine herself published an autobiography talking about her transition, and on top of this, the doctor who treated her, Dr. Harry Benjamin, was an outspoken supporter of using gender-confirming surgery to treat patients with gender dysphoria. He would actually publish a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon in 1966, just months before the riots. And so the trans community at this time was experiencing an unprecedented exposure that they had never seen before. And although it was somewhat good to get the idea of being trans and attempting to normalize it to 1960s America, it also caused a great deal of fear for very obvious reasons. Harry Benjamin would actually go on to open up a practice in San Francisco not far from the Tenderloin, where he offered gender affirming care, such as providing hormones and even gender affirming surgery. Many of the people involved with the upcoming cafeteria riots were, in fact, his patients, and it's his understanding and the care he provided that many historians cite as being one of the reasons they decided to rise up and rebel when they did. So by 1966, the Tenderloin was home to a fairly large community of trans women and drag queens who really saw themselves as being, quote, the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. Those who were lucky to, quote, pass as cis women found themselves lucky, but those who didn't found themselves constantly being on high alert for the next sign of danger. Murders were also at an all-time high during this period, especially trans women of color. They're still at an all-time high, who, like I said, mainly relied on sex work to survive, and sadly, a lot of times, these late-night calls would end up in their murders. And these trans women found no help from the local PD, who often didn't even report the murders of trans people and just chalked them up as to being either isolated incidents of violence or a gay lover's quarrel.
Gay lovers quarrel. They love that one.
They love to use that excuse. Now, around 1966, there was even a serial killer active in the Tenderloin who specifically targeted trans women and would often sexually mutilate them before killing them and dumping their bodies around the area. Now, I could actually find little info about this still uncaught serial killer, and most of what we know about this time period and the Compton's cafeteria riots actually come from Susan Stryker and a 2005 documentary called Screaming Queens. So that's how little it was reported on. You can find maybe one small blurb in a local newspaper. They're like, oh, there's fears of a serial killer targeting trans women. Anyway, and you can just see how frustrating it is now. I can't imagine how it was back then. So in the documentary, Susan interviews several people who were actually there at the riots and lived in the area at the time, and they were the ones to tell their stories to her. The only true area of town that the trans community of Tenderloin found actual safety and privacy was at the El Rosa Hotel. This proved to be one of the only places in the entire city that would rent to people who were openly trans. Not only did they rent to them, they embraced them and sought to be a safe haven for them to gather, and this led to a majority of the community taking up residence here and kind of forming their own little compound. The owner of the hotel, Amanda Del Rosa, even allowed them to use the hotel as a place to safely conduct sex work, allowing them to bring their johns back to their rooms for the sexual encounters, while other girls stationed around the hallways to keep guard just in case something happened. So, of course, this was very helpful. It allowed for them a space to gather, talk, and organize for their own safety. And one of the only other places in the Tenderloin that acted as a sort of meeting ground for the trans and drag queen communities was a very popular 24-hour diner called Compton's Cafeteria, located on Taylor and Turk Street. And as some of our listeners live in the Castro, and you probably know exactly where these areas are, I really want to visit them. Hopefully, maybe this year, I definitely want to get out there. Now, since the diner was open at all hours of the day and night, it proved to be one of the only spots where people could get off the street, eat, rest their feet, or just meet up with friends. And being located in the Tenderloin, it soon became a hot spot for the queer community to gather once all the bars let out. Many from this time stated the cafeteria was more of a hangout spot than a restaurant, as people would spend hours sitting inside sipping on a cup of coffee, either to socialize or just to escape the harshness of outside. And you gotta imagine, you're a sex worker, a trans sex worker of color, on the street. You could be jumped or kidnapped at any moment. So just to go somewhere, just to sit down, feel safe, relax, get your strength back up, is a godsend. Now, established as a chain restaurant in the 1940s by a local man named Gene Compton, the cafeteria was very popular throughout the city, but none more so than the one on 101 Taylor Street at Turk. Despite most of the late night clientele being members of the queer community, specifically trans women and drag queens, It's not like the cafeteria welcomed them with open arms, and in fact did whatever they could to try and put a stop to it or discourage them from hanging around. Staff and management frequently called the police to report, quote, female impersonators loitering around the cafeteria. This often resulted in members of the community being harassed and arrested for lewd behavior due to being dressed as a woman. Despite this constant police presence, this also hurt the cafeteria itself, as these arrests and visits often resulted in the entire cafeteria being shut down for the night, which of course is bad for business. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here.
Also, you're running off your main clientele, so that's bad for business as well.
That's too, money's money. If they're spending money and there's a lot of them, you think most businesses, even whatever your personal beliefs are, they'd be like, all right, I mean, as long as they're...
I run a business to make money.
And you're literally shutting your business down and hemorrhaging money because you're like, I don't want those drag queens in my...
Female impersonators
in my cafeteria. Pretty soon, the cafeteria began enforcing service fees for trans people in an attempt to get them to go away, and continue to call police to arrest and harass them, with many often fighting back due to literally doing nothing wrong except just wanting to sit down and enjoy a cup of coffee, or a chat with friends like everyone else is doing in the restaurant. So tensions between the community and Compton's cafeteria were already at an all-time high, but unlike in years past, where the queer people would often just kind of silently slip back into the shadows to prevent from being outed, that wasn't happening these days. Now, more and more queer people were proving unafraid of the police and openly began to argue and fight back against their oppressors. One of the reasons for this was the formation of a local activist group formed in 1965. That year, a small group of young queer people got together and decided to form a social and political group they called Vanguard. Now, the group was made up almost exclusively of hustlers and sex workers, with many of them being homeless and living on the streets of San Francisco. The idea of the group was to raise awareness and provide protection for the community against the growing harassment by police. And also, it's spurred by civil rights movements starting, opposition to Vietnam. So you really see the youth of America is finally like, F the government, this is wrong. If we stand up as one, they have to listen to us. And that had a ripple effect across all groups. So now queer people are like, no, if they can do it, we can do it. We're tired of being harassed, so why not? Literally have nothing to lose.
Yeah, if everybody else is doing it, why not us?
Now, it would go on to become the first gay youth organization in America. Like many queers in the area, the Vanguard group would often gather at Compton's cafeteria, and like the others, they were subject to constant harassment and being kicked out for loitering. The group itself, having been in response to queer people who were tired of being pushed around, did not take the harassment lightly and decided to actually fight back, resulting in a picket protest held by Vanguard on July 19, 1966, outside of Compton's cafeteria. Now, the picket would not result in much noise except for a single news article published after the event the next day entitled, quote, "Young Homos Picket Compton." What a title. Now, despite the little initial impact, everyone agreed that this protest was the spark that would eventually grow into the full-blown riot that would occur the very next month. And with that, we are finally at the riot itself, an event that is still somewhat shrouded in mystery and honestly, sadly, still has a lot of unanswered questions because, in fact, historians still aren't even sure of the exact date that it occurred, as the riots were never reported on in the local newspapers, and it would be years before anyone would actually write about it, and by that point, a lot had been lost to history. So that's how obscure this initially was. It was not reported on by any newspaper, any possible police record from that time was lost, and it wasn't written down for years.
That doesn't surprise me.
It doesn't, and of course I think you would... Once you hear the details of the riot, you're going to realize probably why the police kind of worked to suppress any mention of it in the newspaper. Because when I say riot, I mean there were people getting chased. So the events of that night would remain in relative obscurity for almost 30 years before it was rediscovered by chance in 1995 by Susan Stryker. Now, she was looking through the archives of the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society in San Francisco when she came across a pamphlet advertising San Francisco's gay pride events for 1972. Going through it, she came across a small article in the paper that detailed the city's first known riot, which predated Stonewall by 3 years. The article detailed an all-out brawl between trans people, drag queens, and police that spilled out into the streets after starting inside of Compton's cafeteria. Following this discovery, Susan dedicated the next 10 years of her life tracking down everyone she could from that time and piecing together the story of America's lost and forgotten Stonewall. By that point, no one could remember what the actual date was, as memories had faded and police records from that time no longer existed. But one thing no one who was there that night could forget was the impact that event would have on San Francisco's queer community moving forward that continues to this very day. All right, so what we know is that on one hot August night in 1966, Compton's cafeteria was bustling, as it often was, with at least 60 patrons. The vast majority of them were trans, drag queens, and other queer people who had just left the bars for the night, as they all sat around talking and hanging out. Now, at some point in the night, as per usual, staff called police to break up the queers, and several officers entered the restaurant and approached a table seemingly at random. They began their usual routine of questioning the patrons, poking them with their nightsticks, and threatening to arrest them if they didn't come quietly. Now, for some reason, this night in particular, the group of trans queens the cops were harassing had had enough, and they refused to move from the table. It got to the point that one officer grabbed a still unnamed woman, quote, only remembered to history as a beautiful transsexual drag queen, and he yanked her out of her seat by the arm and began to try and drag her out of the cafeteria. She began to resist and grabbed a cup of coffee, throwing it at the officer's face in order to make him let go of her. Following this, according to director Susan Stryker, the cafeteria erupted, as this was the signal for them to start rebelling against the other officers in the restaurant. The queer patrons of the bars began shouting at the officers to leave them alone, hurling salt and pepper shakers, containers of sugars, and chairs at them. Windows were smashed out, and the drag queens began to beat officers with their purses and stab them with their high-heel stilettos, pushing them further and further towards the doors, and within minutes, the scene was chaos, with the officers finally retreating out of the cafeteria and back to their patrol cars in order to request backup. So that can probably kind of let you know, like, most officers probably aren't going to want people to know, like, yeah, I got beaten up by a drag queen. But even with the officers out of the restaurant, the queens didn't stop, and the chaos flooded out onto the streets as they continued to advance on the officers, screaming and throwing things at them, and pretty soon the officers began fighting back, punching and kicking the queens, but found themselves outmatched as several began to gang up on them. By the end of it, a police cruiser was destroyed. The newsstand at the corner of the street was in flames as paddy wagons arrived to begin hauling the rioters off to jail, many of whom made no attempt to flee as they held their heads high as they were loaded in. And that was another difference. It wasn't like they fought and then ran. Something that was very different this time around was they were like, arrest me. I'm not afraid. I'm not ashamed. I'm proud that I stood up for it. And of course, you know how that is. It inspires people. Wow. So, due to records no longer existing, it's unclear how many were hurt or how many were arrested that night, but the message was clear. By morning, news of what had happened the previous night spread throughout the Tenderloin, Castro, and south of the market. Those who weren't there that night continued the protest, although less violent. By morning, Compton's cafeteria had issued a complete ban on trans and queer people from entering the establishment, and in response, members of Vanguard and other members of the community staged another picket protest outside the restaurant, which ended with them shattering the newly reinstalled glass windows before leaving. Now, although the riot seemed to end almost as quickly as it began, and few details of what was specifically happened that night are lost, over the following months, though, minor protests continued throughout the districts. Vanguard members organized a large-scale protest sometime in the autumn of 1966, which they called a street sweep. Over 50 members brought large brooms and began to sweep the streets of the Tenderloin and the Castro, shutting down traffic as a protest of police's routine of, quote, sweeping queers off the street at night. They publicly spoke about how law enforcement treated trans people like trash that needed to be swept up, and that they would no longer stay silent, with Compton's being only the beginning if things didn't start to change. And surprisingly, things actually did start to change. And this is where we enter Sergeant Elliot Blackstone of the SFPD, a man who was assigned to public relations for the San Francisco queer community in the mid-1960s. Now, essentially what his job was, it was to go into these queer communities and sort of build relations with them, public relations, get to know their issues, their struggles, and to form at least a somewhat polite bond between them and police, as it was clear the community was growing in numbers. It's one of those things where it's like, yes, being gay may be illegal, but there are thousands of them in the city doing quote-unquote illegal activity, and if we do not come to some understanding, it is literally going to be chaos nonstop. So they assign one officer to be like, go in there, trying to figure out what their problems are, get to know them, let them know the police aren't all bad, quote unquote. And that was I'm sure, a daunting task in 1960s America.
I mean, these are thousands of people that's also stimulating the economy by buying things and probably paying taxes.
Oh, yeah.
And all of this stuff. So this is like huge communities of people that nobody wants around, except they do want their money.
Oh, they want your money. And that's one of the big reasons, too. It's not like we actually care about the queer people, but they are bringing in some hefty cash. So I guess we might want to come to some sort of understanding. Now, for the first few years, little work Elliot did was noticed or cared about by his fellow officers. That is until after the riots at Compton. At first, many in the community were wary of Elliot, a very macho, straight man type, and Elliot himself would state he initially had little desire to work with them, but that did quickly start to change. Elliot would admit he was indifferent to queer people, but after working with them for several weeks, he began to research and read up on every book he could find in relation to homosexuality and transgenderism. Eventually, he and the queer community would come to respect one another as Elliot genuinely began to advocate for them and for police to lessen their crackdowns, even taking the stand at a public conference in 1965 and asserting, quote, they, meaning gay and trans people, only want to live their lives in peace, to live their lives as true as they see fit. That's what we all want, to be able to have the freedom to live how we want to live. Elliot began working with the Vanguard Group along with various other queer organizations around the city and even began raising money at his church in order to provide hormones to various trans people he had come to befriend within the Tenderloin. So that's where it shows you it's kind of beyond like I'm doing this because it's my job. He got 1965, by the way, got his church involved. He's like raising money to get hormones for trans people. And so this dude very much was a saint.
I mean, look what happens when you take the time to just talk to people and learn about what they're going through.
It is, and I actually wrote it into the script. It's always things like this that restore your faith in humanity. There's so many bad people. There's so many bad things that happen to people who don't deserve them. But then someone like Elliot comes along and shows you that there's always a light in the darkness. And it's just like the video we posted that went viral. There are so many nasty comments in there, but then you have so many comments from people that are not only defending you, but saying like how much they love and respect you. And it really is, it's moments like that and it's people like that that remind you, it's not all bad. There are a lot of good people out there.
And just like in that video, it's just people doing their thing, not hurting anybody, trying to live their life however they want, and people just can't stand to see it.
I was going to say how miserable you have to be to comment on a video of people having fun with their friends and try to put them down. That's a whole new level of crappy. So following the Compton Cafeteria Riot, the SFPD began looking at ways to better their relationship with the queer community, as it was clear they were severely outnumbered now, and the queers were no longer going to just lay down and be kicked around. So now they're like, well, okay, there are thousands of them, there are less of us, and now they're mad. Elliot took charge on this issue and began to advocate for ways they could mend the relationship between the two groups. He began leading sensitivity training classes for the SFPD, which every graduate from the academy had to take in order to join the force. He helped establish an office within the Tenderloin to begin an anti-poverty program, which helped pull the community out of poverty and get them stable jobs. He worked closely with leaders from Vanguard and local queer churches to hear what they wanted to change and how the PD could better support them. This meant no more unjustified raids on gay bars, and especially No more harassment of drag queens and trans women simply walking down the street. Now, despite the gender laws still being in place and they wouldn't be repealed until 1972, members of the queer community were surprised when Elliot took these concerns seriously, and within weeks of the riots, they began seeing less and less harassment from officers patrolling the areas. They were now able to walk the street, even in broad daylight, and found little pushback from police to the point they began to feel comfortable walking into a store and trying on women's dresses, something they would not have been able to do before. Elliot worked with officials in the area to also put members of the community into contact with people who could help. This included bringing in Dr. Joel Fort, who worked for a branch of the San Francisco Department of Mental Health and was an early pioneer for gender-affirming care. Partnering with leaders in the community, trans women were able to be issued, quote, special ID cards that certified they were a trans woman and receiving gender-affirming care from licensed individuals. With this card, they were able to fully protect themselves from harassment from police, even outside the Tenderloin, as anyone carrying this card was not breaking the law. So, and, it's a big step back then because now, the Tenderloin, they may have stopped in the Tenderloin, but everywhere else in the city, no. But given these cards moving forward, this was now, if you had this card, police couldn't arrest you, a trans woman, for quote-unquote cross-dressing.
Yeah, I mean, all this harassment and everything, you have to think, this is happening in the gay communities, where most of the people in them are gay.
Mm-hmm.
So outside of that community where most of the people are straight, I mean, that's like the wild, wild west for a gay person, walking out of their community somewhere else. You don't have even the protection of your community at that point.
And so this was a big, also small, just comfort. It was a step in the right direction. Programs were also put into place in the area that not only helped the trans community to get steady jobs such as clerks and receptionists, but also provided ways for many to go back to school and college. Many trans women at the time were able to not only receive gender-affirming care, but to go back to school and get an education as their true, authentic self thanks to these programs. Many commented that it was through the help of people like Dr. Fort and Sergeant Blackstone that they realized they could be whatever or whoever they wanted to be, and that the possibilities of what they did with their lives was endless. And again, also back in the 1960s, as a trans woman, especially a trans woman of color, there is a sense of hopelessness, even if you are out and living in a gay neighborhood. It's like, I can't get a job anywhere else. I can't go to school. No one, what is there for me except to just try to survive?
All the odds are stacked against me.
And so it's through these programs that they're like, you can do whatever you want. You can be the woman you want to be and still go to school. And that's why these programs are so important. Now, when the documentary Screaming Queens premiered to a sold-out crowd at the Castro Theater back in 2005, one of the people in attendance was Elliot Blackstone, who received a standing ovation. And when asked by an audience member why he, as a straight white man, would go through so much trouble for the community during a time where it wasn't seen as acceptable, he simply stated, quote, because my religion teaches me to love everybody. And period. Snaps for Elliot.
Snap.
And that's how it should. He's like, I'm a Christian, and the God I believe in says love everyone and to help everyone. When he retired from the force in 1975, he was honored for his work with the queer community, and Elliot would sadly pass away in 2006. And that same year, he was given the Lifetime Achievement Grand Marshal Award at that year's San Francisco Gay Pride. And to this day, he is seen as a hero, saint, literally a saint in the queer community for everything he did. And I always love seeing things like that because it's like, you had no obligation. People looked at you weird for being accepting of them. They would have loved you if you weren't. And the fact that you have people like that could stand up and stand out of the crowd, especially a police officer, and still be like, no, I don't care if this isn't the norm. This is wrong. It just shows you that there are really, really good people. They're just good at heart. Now, following the riot at Compton's, although it caused many changes within the way the city interacted with the trans community, the event was unknown outside of San Francisco. Like I said, it was never reported on in the newspapers, and there was no written record of it happening until someone decided to revisit it when writing about the city's 1972 Pride events. This would be the only mention of the riot for the next 30 years. causing it to be almost entirely forgotten, except by those who were there to experience it. Following the work done by Susan Stryker to document the riots starting in 1995, we now know that this marked a very important turning point for queer liberation and that Stonewall was not the first act of rebellion. Following the documentary, the riot began getting recognized for its importance across the world. At the conclusion of the 2016 San Francisco Trans March, a new sign was unveiled to change the name of Taylor Street, where the cafeteria was located, to Gene Compton's Cafeteria Way. That same year, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the uprising, a historical marker was placed on the corner of Turk and Taylor to commemorate the uprising, which read, and I'll actually let Brad read this.
Here marks the site of Gene Compton's Cafeteria, where a riot took place one August night when transgender women and gay men stood up for their rights and fought against police brutality, poverty, oppression, and discrimination in the Tenderloin. We, the transgender, gay, lesbian, and bisexual community, are dedicating this plaque to these heroes of the civil rights movement.
Gene Compton's Cafeteria never recovered from the riots, and they closed their doors in 1972. And for years, no one even had a photo of the actual cafeteria, and none was known to exist, only adding more mystery to this already mysterious but so important event, shrouding the details of the riots even more. That is until in 2021, when someone stumbled across a news article from August 1970 detailing a fire at the hotel directly beside Compton's, and in one of the photos we get a clear view of what the restaurant looked like during that time. In January of 2025, the building that once housed the cafeteria was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The Compton's Cafeteria riots continue to serve as a reminder that the fight for equality has raged on for decades and that we are not going anywhere anytime soon. And that is the story of one of the earliest known queer rebellions predating Stonewall by 3 years that was almost completely forgotten about until by chance someone stumbled upon it, and now we know this very important moment in history and it will live on forever. And that's the importance of documenting this kind of things, because you think of how many acts of rebellion and uprisings that weren't documented, and it's really sad to think that those people that had the courage to stand up didn't get their courage memorialized or remembered for decades to come. And so one of the things we like to do with this podcast is try to keep that spirit alive and cover as many of these uprisings and rebellions as possible, especially in the current climate we're in. Got to keep on fighting the good fight, even if it's arguing with bigots on a video of you and your friends at a drag show, an adult drag show on Instagram. We still have uprisings and rebellions that may look a little different in the digital age, but sometimes you do have to just take to the street.
And I mean, to go back to that video, there's a lot of people that's like, that drag queen is a man, because drag queens cannot be women. And people are like, yes, they can. Drag queens can be women. So it's like, there is like, it's a cesspool fight in some ways, but also it's teaching a lot of stuff to a lot of people, because they're like, wow, I actually did not know that drag queen could be women. Not the people arguing, the people that's also on the same side.
I was about to say, and that's the thing, like it's a little bit of everything, you know. And even the people that were on the like our side were like, yeah, like people shouldn't be saying all this stuff, but also a woman can't be a drag queen. And so several of us had to be like, no. Women very much, you know, AFAB queens can very much be drag queens. And it has also been a teaching lesson. And sometimes, you know, depending on how they approach it, sometimes you teach them, sometimes you got to cuss them out.
Well, the thing is, so many people come with their mind made up. They're not there to learn something new.
They want to argue.
They want to argue, and they want to prove they're right. And so you're not teaching people anything like that. But if they read it, hey, maybe they retain a little bit of it, you know?
And that's all we can hope for, honestly. And with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot. It helps other people discover the podcast. And of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you guys have a creepy, spooky, paranormal, or funny story or coming out story, you can send it to us at our email at beerswithqueerspodcast@gmail.com, or send it to us on Instagram. We are putting together a little, I guess, listeners tale episode, just a lighthearted bonus episode where we can kind of let loose more and just have fun and take a little break from all the madness of the world. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at beerswithqueerspod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until Monday, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.